Hello and good evening. Greetings and welcome to Gaming Materials, a new monthly show on all things games brought to you by This Is Revolution podcast and Varn Blog. My name is Djene Bajalan, and tonight we will be talking about the big beast. It is our first episode, so we thought we'd tackle something pretty big, pretty heavy, and pretty important to all you nerds out there, and that is the mother of all RPGs, Dungeons and Dragons. However, before we get to the topic of the evening, I'd like to remind you all to like, subscribe, hit the bell, and leave a comment. We do all read the comments. I know Jason does. I know Pascal does. And we often have a chat about it on our private chitter-chatter. If you have the means, consider becoming a patron. We could always use the Patreon to help keep bringing this product to you all. And as a patron, you get exclusive access to our Discord server and extra materials, including the after hours. And, I will also add that once we get to 1,000 patrons, and by we, I mean Jason and Pascal, will be doing a live show somewhere in California. So we really need to get those numbers up because I think it's going to be fun. So the idea behind this show was to take a look at popular culture. And of course, who better to assist me in this quest than my co-host and the co-sponsor of this show, a member of the TIR Zero Books Extended Universe. He is the hammer of theory, the bad dad of the online left, and the bane of Doug Lane's life. He's also having several technical issues this evening, so hopefully it will be functioning, and hopefully he will be here. And he is, of course, Derek Varn. Let's pray for his technology. Hello.
Hi.
Varn. Welcome. Let's hope that technology keeps holding out. So, we are extremely lucky this evening for this inaugural episode of Gaming Materials to have a very special guest. He is a writer and the host of Toy Galaxy on YouTube, a channel that focuses on pop culture history, videos on the origins, societal impact of television, movies, cartoons, and action figures, all wrapped in an entertaining format that appeals to people who aren't even collectors. He's, of course, the one, the only Dan Larson. Welcome,
Hello.
Dan.
Oh, thank you very much for having me here. What a great intro.
Well, thank you very much for agreeing to come here. We're super excited to speak with you as one of the leading authorities on the internet on nerd culture.
What an honor. What a responsibility.
It is a great responsibility, but we believe that you can execute this responsibility with grace, wisdom, and charisma. Maybe even a bit of strength and dexterity. Who knows?
As long as I roll well. Yeah, absolutely.
As long as you roll well. So, I have a little video for everyone to watch just to get us all in the mood. As I said on the outset, we will be talking about Dungeons and Dragons, which is one of the most influential role-play games, if not the most influential role-play game in the world. It is very much the Kleenex, the Hoover, the tampon of role-play games, where the brand becomes associated with the product. So I have a little advert to get you all in the mood, and we will talk about that and come back. So here we go.
Your dungeon master has placed you in a dreadfully precarious position. You're playing the most phenomenal game ever created. Your skin grows cold from your first glimpse of the enormous beast. It's a product of your imagination. Survival depends on a quick, decisive move. Your choices are limited. Stand and fight, or run. Use your lightning bolt. Victory is yours.
Win the treasure.
TSR Hobbies, Dungeons and Dragons games. Products of your imagination.
So, do either of you ever remember seeing that advert?
I remember seeing that cartoon.
Oh, you've seen the cartoon?
Yeah.
That is a classic advert. So, I just want to introduce the topic a little bit more extensively before we go to questions and discussion. For those of you who are not aware, Dungeons and Dragons is probably one of the oldest fantasy role-play games. It was developed by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson in the early 1970s in Wisconsin. Wisconsin was kind of like the Silicon Valley of nerd role-play games in the early 1970s. It came out of a tabletop miniature game called Chainmail, which sort of cross-pollinated with a role-play war game called Bronstein. And this, out of this kind of stew, emerged the first fantasy role-play game, which took on a lot of influences of the time, a lot of the fantasy and pulp genre of the era. We often associate it with Tolkien, but of course, Jack Vance's Dying Earth was extremely important. You have Conan, Fritz Leiber, Mooncroft, all these sort of fantasy, pulp fantasy writers playing a big role in sort of providing a lot of the material for the discourse. And of course, by the late 70s, the company founded by Gygax and Arneson, TSR, was publishing Dungeons and Dragons. And in the 80s, of course, it took off. In the late 90s, TSR was in trouble and was taken over by Wizards of the Coast. And of course, eventually Hasbro. Wizards of the Coast released a third edition of D&D, which is a little bit of a complex name, which we can perhaps get into in a bit. In 2008, they released the fourth edition that nobody liked. And then in 2014, they released a fifth edition, which has been stupendously popular, especially in the age of COVID. As people now play online, we have all these things like Critical Role, Geek and Sundry, where you have actual professional voice actors reading it. So role-play really seems to be tabletop role-play, should I say, really seems to be in a renaissance at the moment. So I'd kind of like to begin by asking both Varn and starting perhaps with Dan, I guess, what was your first exposure to Dungeons and Dragons? Oh, you've gone quiet. Oh, Dan.
Tonight, hang on.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, there we go. We have your sound back.
Okay, yeah. For whatever reason, it's coming off my webcam instead of my microphone, so that's great. As long as you can hear me, I guess.
We can hear you now. Yes.
Okay, good. For me, first exposure to Dungeons and Dragons would have been simultaneously the role-playing game itself, the cartoon, and then also the action figures, because all three of those things for me were sort of hitting at the same time. When it really started to become big, I was probably on the younger side of who the sort of target demographic really was at the time. I have an older brother who's a couple years older than me, so he was really into it. He was really into the sort of management and the numbers and the rolling and the stats and all that stuff. And it was weird because there's only two of us, right? So he would DM and I would play, and all I wanted to do was like make up crazy characters and draw them, Right. So it was a weird sort of dynamic there. But I would say I was probably about maybe 9, maybe 10 years old when I first heard of what Dungeons and Dragons was. And so the way my brother and I were playing it was absolutely not the way that you were intended to play. He had a campaign module. He'd basically just read through it. I would make a bunch of stupid decisions, because I was a 10-year-old kid, didn't know really what I was supposed to be doing, and that was about the extent of it. The Saturday morning cartoon, I'd watch that, and then I had a couple of the action figures.
Yeah, I think the Saturday morning cartoon was definitely a way that many of us were introduced into D&D. But I think, all those things, the action figures, less popular in the UK were the action figures, but definitely the cartoon was a big one with Uni and the Barbarian Kid and Presto, although I always found that, I think definitely in the late 80s, early 90s, the demographic that D&D was being aimed at was certainly perhaps a bit younger than it is today. I think 8, 9 was when I started playing, and I think it's a little bit different today. What about you, Varn? When did you first become exposed to Dungeons and Dragons?
I grew up with the cartoon too. Although it would have been when I was very young. I think the cartoon would have been off by the time I was 7 or 8 years old. I first started playing. My mom got me secondhand the RC version black box, which I believe came out in about 91. We started ad hoc piecing together parts of Advanced D&D, second second edition and second edition revised, which again, we bought them all secondhand from like flea markets and stuff, and that'll come in later about part of the problem with 80s to 90s D&D. It was an affordable hobby, and nobody played it correctly from what I can tell. I don't think anyone played D&D correctly until probably about 3.5, because basically everybody made it work with house rules. I remember being really into Planescapes, but I don't think I ever actually played it or ran it. I just think I would just hunt down the maps and the art from it, which was gorgeous at the time. Then White Wolf happened around the time I was actually entering high school, particularly around the time of second ed White Wolf, and I just walked away from D&D probably for 10 years. Picked it back up in college, off of old games. So I was buying kind of old PC games, all the let's see, the Icewind Dale and those games, and I was buying them late. Planescape's Torment, and then right around that time that I was buying those old games late, the Wizards of the Coast released 3.0, and I stayed with it through 3.0, 3.5. When the open license kind of fell through around 4, and everybody hated 4, I flirted with Pathfinder for a little bit, and then just left the country and didn't think about it. And picked it back up about 4 years ago, about 3 years into 5th edition. One of the interesting things about 5th edition is, outside of like 74 to Beck Me, right? It's kind of the longest standing D&D edition, and we haven't really noticed how long it's been around.
Yeah, it's been long.
So
it's
interesting.
It's very sustainable. Have you played D&D or been involved in D&D in adulthood, Dan, or do you just consume it as a collector?
No, I absolutely did. We played, like, as a kid, I played just with my brother, and that lasted maybe 2 weeks or so. And then in high school, I managed to, my group of friends, we were playing every single weekend, extended campaign, long enough for characters to die and get brought back, and siblings and friends and rivalries to all, occur, character arcs, all that stuff. And those are still characters that, I still have, dear to me because of the things that happened. And, my friends and I still talk about that. So that's like, mid 90s, 93, 94, around there, probably even 92, 93. And then, like Varn, you were just saying, stepped away for probably 15, 20 years. And then, Toy Galaxy started in 2015. But right before we started the channel, I was actually in a D&D group. And my sort of, we'd play, it was 4 or 5 of us. And every Wednesday night, we'd play Dungeons & Dragons, get a good 2-3 hour session in. And it was the end of that ended up transitioning into starting Toy Galaxy. So my D&D got replaced with Toy Galaxy.
Well, yeah, it can be quite a time and even emotional commitment. I have known friendships to be ruined over killed characters, or at least people not.
Oh, we had to kick somebody out of the group this time 5 years ago, 6 years ago. We had to kick somebody out of the group because he was taking it way too personally.
Yeah, people take it, but it is a very unique type of hobby. It's when you think about it, it is really, it's make-believe, but organized make-believe, which is a kind of interesting thing. And it's interesting that today people are coming back to it in their adulthood. I mean, people I think a lot of people, like you say, played as a child, walked away from it, and then once they were older, were like, you know what, this was actually good fun. I would actually like to, have a little game, play a little make-believe. And it really speaks to the kind of changing culture of adult culture, that we're now, coming back to a lot of the nostalgia and things that we can't, that we did if we grew up in the 80s or 90s. that came up. So before we move on, I do want to do a quick little quiz for Dan as our guest, because I want to test his D&D knowledge. I want to test his D&D knowledge.
We'll see.
And well, I think you'll at least get one. Varn mentioned the art, and I think one of the striking things about Dungeons and Dragons, and Dan, you're an artist, so you probably can appreciate this, is that how iconic some of the imagery from Dungeons and Dragons has become in popular culture across the West in recent years. So I want to see if you can guess who some of these people are, some of these things are. So I'm just going to put this up on the screen. So, Dan.
Yes.
Who is this? What is this an image of?
This is Tiamat. This is the Dragon of Dragons.
Yes, this is the Dragon of Dragons, Dungeons and Dragons, intellectual property, distinct dragon god. Okay, let's try this one.
And featured in the animated series. They made a toy of it. LJN made a figure.
Ah, okay. What about this?
This is my guy, Warduke.
Warduke. And who exactly is Warduke?
It depends on which angle you want to come at it from. The sort of development of the character was simultaneous in the campaign modules. He'd pop up here and there. He's an evil, knight, basically a dark knight. And then he'd show up, I think 2-3 appearances on the animated series as well. And those two characterizations didn't necessarily match. But then again, when you're talking about a role-playing game, it depends on who plays the character anyway.
Do you have a Warduke a figurine?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I have both versions. They made a regular version that's just sort of posable, and then they made the Battle-matic version, which has a little switch on the back that activates the sword swinging action.
Ooh, that sounds actually pretty cool. Okay,
yeah.
What about this? What is this?
This is, I don't know the character's name. This character would have been introduced at a time where I wasn't actually actively involved. I don't know if that is a Mind Flayer. But,
it is a Mind Flayer.
Yeah,
it is a Mind Flayer. That was good. Okay, we got just a few more. What about this? What is this?
This is a Beholder.
Another Mind Flayers and Beholders, again, another intellectual property of Wizards of the Coast now. And finally, this is the tough one. Maybe I'll give this one to Varn. Varn, can you tell me what this is from? This image is from?
The Into the Borderlands module.
Wow, that was good. That was impressive. That is
one of the first modules that was ever made.
I was going to say, it looks real familiar to me. That might have been one of the 2 or 3 that my brother and I ran through.
Well, the Keep on the Borderlands was an extremely influential campaign module, because I believe, if I'm not incorrect, it was packaged with either the advanced, the expert, or the basic set. So it's something that a lot of people who were introduced to Dungeons and Dragons in the 80s would have been familiar with this piece of art, which is it looks kind of primitive, but there is something charming about these old style images. And we're actually seeing a lot of artists who are involved in the old school Renaissance, these kind of like retro clones of Dungeons and Dragons that try to get back to the 80s experience, really emulating this type of art. Whereas today the art you see is a lot more sophisticated and like just more impressive art than you would be expect.
Yeah,
so,
I tend to prefer that sort of simplistic, almost generic. I mean, Warduke is a pretty specific characterization, but when it comes to those sort of battle scenes and stuff, I think it helps the sort of imagination of it, the customization and the characterization that you bring to it. The more sort of generic that it is, the more specific and detailed. Like I've never been attracted to like fiction, books, novels, and stuff that are based in a Dungeons and Dragons world, because I don't want to be told who the characters are specifically. I don't want their histories and things to already be filled in. That's part of the fun of those adventures, is to discover it along the way.
Yeah, I think definitely the the kind of the emergence of Dungeons and Dragons fiction was like a critical moment in the development of the game, in terms of this split between people who are really into the like emergent storytelling that takes place, and people who kind of want to. And I'm not making any moral judgments to all the nerds out there. I'm not saying one way is better or another, but some people want to play a hero in a film, very much this more storyteller version, whereas there is another kind of player who likes that emergent gameplay that you find in a lot of the early D&D, where the story it's randomly generated by dice rolls rather than along a set storyline as per the Dragonlance novels and the modules that went along with the Dragon.
Well, and I think as I played it through sort of 3 different stages of my growing up, very young, teen, and then adult, it was far more interesting as an adult because people were able to bring more of their own personal experience and their worldliness and their interactions with different cultures or societies or whatever. One of the people I was playing with was a stand-up comedian, so he had that better sense of, performance and being on stage and wanting to make it entertaining for the rest of the people. We relied a lot more on that sort of characterization and that sort of organic storytelling as opposed to being strictly data and stats and roles driven.
Yeah, how about you, Varn? Which is your preferred method of the D&D way of life?
Depends on what mood I'm in. I tend to be a role play heavy gamer, but I do have a strong attraction to the early modules because they are so wild. I'm a collector of the Goodman's Games re-releases of all these, which come packaged with the originals and then cleaned up versions, and then they'll put in a 5e version. And actually, what one thing I will say about those early modules is I'm kind of surprised D&D survived, because those early modules were not very well put together. And in the 70s, TSR famously took a stance that they didn't even think they would include adventure modules, because why would anyone want to pay for that? Gygax thought that was silly, that every game would be a completely homebrewed game. And what's it, the Vampire Queen? I forget the full title. Came out and it became the first kind of unofficial kind of pirate thing. And then, even though TSR was notoriously litigious in the 80s and the late 70s even, they just licensed it, and then they started making their own. But it was a very rough go if you go back and look at those early modules, and you would have to fill in a lot as a DM to make it work. But that was really kind of fun. Whereas when I came into D&D, and when I came into gaming in general, this actually wasn't just a D&D thing. This is a 90s thing, kind of, for 90s tabletop gaming. Everything was meta plot heavy. Splat books and tie-in novels and by the time that you were getting into when I was a kid, weirdly, a lot of this stuff was both ubiquitous. Like I mentioned, you could buy it off market for cheaper. It was. I know it's hard to imagine now because some of these things are so valuable. But you just buy them at like flea markets and stuff. And then other things would be nearly impossible to find, but they'd be crucial to parts of the game that they were building up for their big meta plot. And so if you were to ask me how I feel into that, I probably would be a person who likes the looser feel now, although that's not what I would have been into when I was a teenager. I would have sought after every stupid Dritz Jordan, whatever, the Dragonlance, the Hickman novels, all that stuff, Greenwood and all that stuff. But it's an interesting thing because I think there's two things there. You have the how developed are these modules and areas and how much you're pulling from yourself, and then also, is it connected to this massive meta plot? And it's interesting if you were to look at today's D&D, because today's D&D kind of has it both ways. They've gotten very good at the whole strategy of referencing kind of things from other editions of D&D, resetting the world in Forgotten Realms, because it's the gaming universe that became most popular. And by the gaming universe, I mean the PC gaming universe that became most popular. Over Greyhawk, which even in the first Wizards edition was a standard world. But what I find fascinating about that is, unlike in prior editions, even prior Wizards of the Coast games like 3.5, they don't fill in the world very much, actually. If you get like the Splat books, a lot of the people who came in the late 90s or aughts are somewhat frustrated because they don't develop everything out. Large parts of things are left out or are even contradictory. Things that were parts of a completely different game worlds in prior editions are going to kind of sort of in Forgotten Realms now. And this is kind of given most of these books the both worlds approach. So you could either just pull from this and go crazy, or you can become a weird back collector and try to figure out what everything originally was. And Wizards doesn't really care, because it'll also sell you all the old books now on Drive-Thru-RPG.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've noticed there's a huge proliferation of the D&D lore channel genre, where people will like go back and look into old editions of Dungeons and Dragons to find out the story. It's like a kind of interesting sort of cultural development, this obsession with lore, which of course YouTube has great, there were blogs before, but now YouTube has really greatly made it possible for like individual creators. I mean, we see it with the Games Workshop crowd and the Games Workshop lore channels, which are huge, although there's a whole load of litigious issues around those, and Games Workshop, like TSR, has a pretty bad reputation. And of course, Games Workshop was basically born out of a British importer of Dungeons and Dragons modules as well. I used to work for Games Workshop in the early 2000s, and this was
nice.
this was a well-known fact at the time, what the origins of the company. But what I kind of want to ask you guys, and I'll start with Dan here, is why do you think D&D, with its kind of hodgepodge of like stock fantasy and even sci-fi, they had spaceships in the early modules, right? Why did that take off in the 1980s? What was the circumstances in America and more generally in the Western world that sort of led to an explosion of D&D? Was it, do you believe, for example, this like multimedia strategy where you had like figurines, cartoons, or was there something in the zeitgeist that sort of made these games sort of popular?
Yeah, I think as a entertainment experience, just the game itself, strictly the game itself, it had gotten sophisticated enough to where it could start to reach out beyond just stats-driven stuff. Because, like you set up in the intro here, that that game was born from just military strategy games. Where a lot of those a lot of the systems are built to literally reenact classic battles. And it's about how can the armies move and what can they carry and how can they fire and all these sorts of things. It's just the combat metrics. That's all it is. So when you add in this role-playing element, that starts to open up the audience. But I think more important than that was the notoriety that it gained from the mystery and from the danger and the urban legends that were starting to crop up around it. It became spooky and mysterious. And that's when it started to spread through word of mouth. It wasn't so much about what was necessarily being advertised on television. I had never seen anything on television other than the cartoon, specifically for the game. The cartoon was just a cartoon. But for the game, it was this spooky thing that my parents weren't 100% sure they wanted me playing, And so, of course, once your parents say no, now you got to play.
Yeah.
Now you absolutely want to play. So it was this mysterious sort of spooky thing that was out there that older kids were playing and older kids were doing. And somebody might have died and somebody might have had an episode where they couldn't get out of character. And you're just like, man, I need to find out what this thing is. So I think in terms of, I think the sophistication of the game itself made it a more widespread thing. And then, like you mentioned, the multimedia exposure. absolutely, cartoon, anything with a cartoon driving a product, driving toys, that's going to get into kids' hands, and then add on that layer of spookiness, and you got a winning hand.
Was it Tom Hanks's breakout role in Monsters and Mazes?
I don't know if I'd say breakout role. It was a role.
It was the Monsters and Mazes I remember coming up in churches. I grew up in the Deep South, and to assimilate to deep Southern culture, my mother would encourage me to go with the Baptist churches, and they would have D&D burnings and stuff. But ironically, I think it is poignant that D&D's popularity is almost directly related to the Satanic Panic. I mean, I kind of believe that, because the literature and stuff it's based off, aside from Tolkien and the Rankin Bass cartoons and the Bakshi cartoon, we'll set those aside because none of those were staples of my childhood, but they weren't popular when they were actually made. They were kind of popular on television and whatnot. The 80s was both a time period of a ton of like cheap, bad sword and sorcery movies, and some good ones. Like, of course, there's the original Conan, there's Beastmaster, but then there's all the other ones, including Conan the Destroyer, which almost felt like it was built from a D&D game. So you have that. You have the cultural response to that. You have the fact that D&D, even though it gets Tolkienized and kind of always was. I mean, halflings are clearly hobbits and are only not called that for lawsuit reasons. But I mean, Gygax himself, was not a particular Tolkien fan. He was way more into Conan. And ironically, if you read Appendix N's literature, there was Appendix N, for those you don't know, is an appendix in the back of the Dungeon Master's Guide listing Gygax's influences, which it seems like was just whatever was on his desk that day. Like, it's really random. But Appendix N literature kind of gets forced into this Tolkienized thing. So you have both Conan and then all this Tolkien stuff, wizards. The magic is not, however, Tolkien magic. It's clearly Vancian, but that's really kind of the only thing that stands out in the popular image of D&D from the Dying Earth is the way the magic works. So you have this melange, but no one really cares about that at the time, I don't think. I think it's coming off of this wave of late 70s, early 80s sword and sorcery movies that were made cheap and dirty. It's the prevalence of Saturday morning cartoons, which they got one, and then it's all the bad press of the Satanic Panic aimed at D&D, which is ironic because Gygax was a Christian and actually like left certain inspirations of D&D even out of the Appendix N because he didn't really want people reading it. Like, he didn't want people going and finding out what was actually in Clark Ashton Smith, for example, kind of famously. And that all that together led to, there was a mystique around it. So when I finally got my hands on the black box, I was like, oh, this is fun, but I don't see what all the Satan stuff was about. And then when I got my hands on Second Ed, and Second Ed Revised, well, they'd already been cleaned up. Like all the devil stuff, all the legions of hell, they don't come back in until Planescapes. Like, it's a very cleaned up, kind of safe world in the early 90s. And then White Wolf happens, GURPS happens, all these kind of riffs, the edgy games all come out, the edgiest of edgy games.
Well, Vampire the Masquerade is probably
the biggest
yeah. edgy games for emos.
No, I mean goths. If we're in early 90s parlance, emos are later.
Emos are later, yeah.
But yeah, I mean you hit the nail on the head, I think, and that's kind of when D&D uses relevance. It's weird to think about. It's because of how defining even some of this like extra stuff is. Like Dragonlance actually in many ways pinned down generic epic fantasy as a genre in conjunction with a few other things. Before that, if you read and you do get this when you read appendix in literature, fantasy and sci-fi are not really separate genres. They bleed over all the time, and they're wild. And after kind of 85 D&D, you see all this stuff really get set in kind of marketing stone in a way that it had not been, because also you had this massive paperback industry that it began in the late 60s up through the 70s, and really kind of became almost like the way we treat comic books now as like an IP production material in the 80s.
Yeah, I think if people look back to writers like Ursula Le Guin or the Elf Queen of Shannara, these are all a mix of fantasy, but also post-apocalyptic sci-fi tropes, which I think is which I think is something that's lost on people today about because this kind of leads to the question I wanted to ask Dan here, and Varn has kind of indicated one of these important cultural impacts, which is sort of the defining of the fantasy genre as distinct from science fiction. But what would you say the cultural impact of Dungeons and Dragons in the 1980s and 1990s has been? What would be? How has it sort of influenced? How has it influenced popular culture in the United States?
I'll be honest. I don't feel like it really has that much. I think it is a branch of science fiction and fantasy and horror. I think if it has done anything, it has established role playing as an entertainment thing, as a thing that can be done for entertainment. But I don't know that Dungeons and Dragons itself. Varn, you've named several different brands that have taken advantage of that same audience and the role playability. I think it's the popularization and the mainstreaming of role play as an accepted thing. To go back to the Satanic Panic and all that stuff, and the mystery and the spookiness and the boogeyman of role playing games in general, to a mainstream culture that didn't really know what was going on there. I think once the scare tactic wore off and you didn't see mass suicides and pet cemetery, rituals and all these sorts of things that were supposedly happening, that were supposedly, unavoidable due to the influence of Dungeons and Dragons. I think once you get past all that and, mainstream can just, moms and dads can kind of look at it and say, they're just telling stories. That's all. There's nothing going on here. It's not a big deal. I think it brings that into pop culture as a safe form of just entertainment for all ages, for anybody who wants to participate. I think that's the main impact.
Fair enough. So, and that's pretty significant in and of itself, as it's a kind of a new, a kind of, storytelling is as old as mankind itself, but this kind of structured storytelling, is extremely popular. And then, of course, in the 90s, we have White Wolf, Vampire the Masquerade, far more edgy role-play games sort of coming to the fore. And
to be fair, though, early 80s role-playing games are also pretty edgy, just not D&D. If you go back and find the Elric game, Stormbringer, by early Chaosium, you literally have to summon demons and do drugs to do any magic in that game. And that's in 1981. The Satanic Panic never catches on to it because I don't think it's Chaosium. I don't think it does so well in the US. I think it ends up being more popular in the UK. But it's a kind of wild story that we picked D&D to be our scary game because it really wasn't. But there were, even if Vampire the Masquerade had just become more popular when it was first written in 1989, I think we would have seen a lot more negative response to that. I mean, that game is not just bloody and vaguely demonic at points, it's also highly sexual.
Well, I think D&D did that. They sort of took the edge off of it, and once people realized that you could have role-playing games that didn't actually affect your livelihood and the safety of your neighbors and, you know, that sort of thing, then it was just like, okay, go do whatever you're going to do. And so now all genres are open. You want to do cyberpunk, whatever. You want to do feudal Japan, whatever. You want to do fantasy and monsters, whatever. No, nobody really cares anymore because that spooky, dangerous aspect of it was taken away. And so everything was fine now.
Yeah. Go ahead, Vaughn. Sorry.
No, it is interesting though, because like, for example, if you look at other TSR games, like, what's the game that's set in space?
Star Frontiers?
No. Yes, Star Frontiers, which is After Traveler. And there's another one too before that. The Warden one. Big ship. I forget. I even have it upstairs. Anyway, those games like TSR actually pushed Star Frontiers in particular because they were afraid of the satanic panic, and it never caught on. Like it like we barely remember Star Frontiers, even though it's kind of an interesting melange of everything 80s spacey. Like there's some Star Trek and some Star Wars and some Flash Gordon and some early 70s Battlestar Galactica in there. And Alpha, crap, I'll remember it. But that, and I always find it interesting. D&D, in some ways, like the Christian right picked the wrong game to pick on because it was really the safe game. So when people found it, of course it was safe. Now,
well, I mean, so much of it is, it's as dangerous as you want to make it. And the reality is that the vast, overwhelming majority of the audience was not actually interested in conducting, satanic rituals and, actually trying to summon demons and stuff. That was just the boogeyman that was out there trying to I don't know, destroy something that didn't exist. So who cares?
It was also interesting. Go ahead.
And also the difference between Dungeons and Dragons and a game that became popular in the 90s, like Vampire the Masquerade, was that Vampire the Masquerade, the World of Darkness, was in our world and was very close to home. Whereas Dungeons and Dragons, it's like it's fantasy. Even the violence is kind of like doesn't seem like a real violence. You kill some goblins. You if you think through the implication of murdering kobolds in their like homes. It's like quite brutal, but there isn't a kind of like aesthetic of violence that you would find in some of those more niche games from the 80s, as well as like Vampire the Masquerade, which became like insanely popular through the LARPing scene. They even made a TV series of it. If you've ever
I remember that too.
The Vampire the Masquerade TV series. But people one season. They should have kept going, but it was anyway. But yeah, it is I think Varn is correct. Like it was really the wrong target, and as you said, Dan, it created a mystique that probably worked very well for TSR, at least in the early days.
Absolutely.
So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking about when we talk about this, D&D in particular for all this. It is interesting how it starts to like its 80s popularity is kind of based off of its 70s persona, like the stuff that's really set when we think about D&D. And when you already look at like the stuff that's coming out in like 87, 88, you start getting like what Spelljammer, and
Ravenloft,
the horror version of the game, which I thought was really cool, was actually my gateway drug into White Wolf when I go back and think about it. I don't think I ever played Ravenloft. I just found like one book. These things were really interesting. Another thing that's interesting about it, though, is the age group it's targeted at, because it is hard for me to imagine that they were targeting my 8 or 9 year olds with D&D, and yet they were like they clearly were.
They're in the commercial.
Right.
Yeah. The action figures are clear.
And in some ways, like if you look at OSR, like the OSR demographic, a core part of its demographic are people who got hit by the first wave of D&D when it was mostly like a game aimed at 7, 8, 9-year-old boys in specific. And it was a very nerdy game. Actually, that was part of how my mom sold it to other people letting me play it, is that it involved math. And what's interesting is we talk about this period, like women in gaming always comes up. But that's already changing by the early 90s. Like White Wolf is clearly expanding the game market. That's part of how they temporarily beat. I mean, if you looked at sales of TSR versus White Wolf in most of the 90s, White Wolf is creaming them because White Wolf has an expanding demographic because it appeals to women. And the other thing that it was coming to mind is you mentioned mazes and monsters. And what's interesting is that focused on a LARP, but D&D LARPs have always been kind of rare. It's not a game that's really conducive to LARPing. It's very mechanics heavy. It's very, in certain iterations, particularly certain later iterations, it's very grid heavy. Whereas a lot of the D10 games, a lot of the storytelling games, they went directly into LARPing like really easily. But LARPs were a lot of what people thought D&D were, which always confused me. Like, because again, it's the effect of that Mazes and Monsters TV movie.
And for those that don't know, LARPing is live action role play. It's an acronym. And that's, you dress up as your character, you act out your character in real time, in real scenes, organically in the fields, in the forest, in the cave, wherever. And some of it has actual combat. And like you just said, there's combat rules, what a hit means. How are you dead? Where are you, you come back? How does your character respond? And that is something that was never a part of Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, I think there's there is a big LARPing scene now, but that's a big, but that's like a very different later phenomenon. So this kind of leads into the penultimate question I kind of had, which was like, how has the culture around D&D changed, especially since the release of 5th edition? What would you say? Because it seems today, and let me set this up, is like we're in a very different world of roleplay games. And I think, of course, it's connected to the broader acceptance of geek culture. Like stuff that was niche in the 70s and 80s is now kind of ubiquitous. There isn't a kind of social stigma around it. If you went around bullying someone for playing Dungeons and Dragons, people would probably think you were kind of an ass nowadays. People. So how and why do you think that's changed? How has the culture changed? Why has it changed? And perhaps more controversially, what is this whole debate about D&D going woke and all the neckbeards getting upset about it?
I think chat's got a handle on it, and as you just said, all of these things that used to be geek interests, nerd interests, whatever, are mainstream interests now. Those of us, those folks that were reading, the Spider-Man comics and the Avengers comics all those years, and trying to convince everybody that they had really good stories in them and really interesting characters, it turns out they were right. There's a lot of really good stories and interesting characters there. And I think as, those movies and properties and all of those things really started to rake in the cash, all the production studios are just looking for companies, whatever, merchandise. They're all just looking for something else that they can associate with that. And I think D&D has always been there, part of that lower pop culture, but also mainstream from all the other exposure, without the boogeyman and anything. So more and more, D&D becomes a popular thing also through celebrity association. It is a cross demographic entertainment medium that you can, we've been looking at putting together D&D for our Twitch channel over here at Toy Galaxy. So to prep myself, I did a really broad survey of what's out there. What are people doing with? How are they presenting the gaming experience? How are people participating in it? Is it dice heavy? Is it graphics heavy? Are people doing character voices? Are they dressed up in costumes? And it turns out, you might be surprised by this, it's all over the place. You know, there are groups that want to do in character with wigs and all the costumes. There are groups that only want to do combat. There are groups that, you know, want to have 30 people involved. There's groups where it's just the DM and one player, you know. And I think that it just took time and some mainstream exposure and that rise of geek culture to allow everybody and the kids that grew up in the 80s to teach their kids and show their families and their descendants that it's just a fun thing to do. It's just period. It's just fun.
But, I mean, and I think it's actually, I think, you know, of course, you know, you kind of indicated about comic books as well. This is one of the interesting things is that we are seeing through like comic book movies that people are taking comics more seriously because, you know, comics were always a good art form, but there was a prejudice against it in Western culture, at least. Role-play games were associated with like nerds, right? I remember, you know, back in the day, my mom wouldn't want to go into the game shop because it smelled really bad.
But she wasn't wrong.
When I worked in Games Workshop, we actually had to eject a kid because he literally got too excited and defecated.
Hey, you know what? Stereotypes exist for a reason, you know, unfortunately.
But I think that, like in the 90s and 2000s, we've seen a lot of people get interested in it. It's a creative thing. There's no reason other than the culture around it why women would be excluded. And I think things like Critical Role. I think one of the things when we look at D&D online, you know, a lot of DMs complain about the Matt Mercer effect. Like everybody watches Critical Role and then they want their Dungeons and Dragons game to be Critical Role. But, you know, there's the game that people play at home, but then there's the professional D&D channels where basically it's a performance. It's like it's improv. It's improv acting, which I think a lot of people don't realize. Like, yeah, these guys on Critical Role, they aren't playing like your regular game of D&D with nachos. They are actors doing a form of improv using the things. But that kind of exposure of like, frankly, talented and handsome and beautiful people playing Dungeons and Dragons opens that up to you have cosplayers cosplaying characters from the Dungeons and from the Critical Role playing game and things like that. So I think it is a really interesting shift. I think that shift, and I don't know what you guys think, is of course provoking reaction amongst people who enjoyed D&D when it was underground. You know, there's a lot of reactions against this, like D&D has gone woke. They don't have races anymore. They have all. It's like, why do we have like black people? It's like, you know, I think that, you know, there's no like sinister plot behind it. It's like, it's marketing, right?
Absolutely, yes. You want to reach the largest audience possible. You know? Before I comment specifically on that, one thing I did want to say as far as it gaining mainstream appeal is at the time that it did, the more entertainment, the sources that we are just bombarded with as the internet has grown, as our Wi-Fi speed gets faster, as social media expands, and we are just 24/7, you know, just immersed in information and entertainment and so many choices and whatever. I think one of the interesting and appealing things about Dungeons and Dragons is how it slows down the entertainment experience. And that, I mean, if you're in combat in Dungeons and Dragons, you know, a turn is like a second. And now we're on like Matrix time, where you could spend 45 minutes doing combat, and in the game time, that's only like 5 minutes. You know, so when you're used to streaming channels of video games and constantly, you know, rounds of I play Rocket League all the time, and it's like 5 minutes, and you're just game through game. Dungeons and Dragons is a way for friends to get together, people to get together. Let's set, you know, an appointment. We're going to get together weekly. We're going to get together monthly, and it becomes a social thing that slows everything down. It doesn't have to be online. Ideally, it is an in-person social thing that's happening. And it's just rare. And more so after 2020, it has become a very rare thing to have those kinds of in-person, slowed down, non-virtual experiences for entertainment.
I think I think that's an extremely important point. We live in an age of neoliberal atomization of society, right? A lot of the old opportunities for communal activity just don't exist anymore. And I think D&D provides, there's a reason why I think you're pointing to it. There is a reason why Dungeons and Dragons is making a comeback now, because like online gaming is cool. I love playing a little bit of online gaming. I love playing Warhammer Total War or like Stellaris online or something. It's like some good fun online. But it is a different experience. Like you say, it slows down. And we need, as people, we need communal activities. And in this like COVID age, that has really been hit home to people. Like how much they need that interaction, and how much like an evening of Dungeons and Dragons is like a break from from a situation where we're all increasingly isolated from one another, where we increasingly are sitting in front of our computer screens working online. And I know a lot of this role playing is being done online, but still there's a kind of intimacy that you get through a Dungeons and Dragons game that you don't get through playing together online.
Yeah, I would add that Dungeons and Dragons specifically, in its early iterations, is kind of a boys' power fantasy, and I think this was already ending before even the end of TSR. It was moving away from that by the late 80s, early 90s. It truly was, but the milieu that it existed in was still very curtailed. And TSR is increasingly ran by suits, particularly after they got rid of Gygax and most of the original founders. Furthermore, and interestingly, I think it is interesting how there is a weird I'm going to use the word dialectics, is one of the most pretentious words I can use, but there is a dialectic between the way the computer games increase the interest in D&D to more than just dude bros, even though, yes, gaming was a largely dude bro phenomenon. But I know a lot of women's first encounter with D&D are those BioWare games in the late 80s and, not 80s, late 90s and aughts, particularly in that time period between when TSR kind of collapsed and when Wizards bought it. Then EverQuest was huge. And that was not primary. It was, I think, more male than female in its demographics, but it was not primarily and heavily as male. White Wolf had also appealed to a much larger female base. Vampire had a lot of female players. So all these things happened. Furthermore, in the United States, if you don't appeal to more than, dude bros in their 40s, you really don't have a buyer's market just from demographics. Like the subset of people who would have been the classical nerd is a smaller and smaller subset of people. Now, that subset of people was also never as white as it was portrayed, probably. I know that in comic books that was always actually not true, that comic books took a long time to realize that a good portion of their market was of color. But that was also true with role playing. I also think the insight that it's in person, or even when you play it in groups online, you still interact in person. You don't play D&D like you play EverQuest or Warcraft, or World of Warcraft, or any of that. You play it interact as a simulation of an in-person interaction most of the time, and that's true for other games too. But it seems to be that's a big way to get people being social. One thing that we have to think about in this way that our society has changed and why D&D would be so different is that entertainment has become less and less communal, as Dan said, for the past 50 years. Across the board, like we and even television, which we used to lament being a non-communal thing, when it was appointment television, and you at least talked about it afterwards. But after the 90s, that's gone too. So so having something that is necessarily communal, necessarily involves interacting with real people as a character, but kind of still as yourself, is a thing that I think really has propelled this to survive. I also think Hasbro Wizards has really been aware of how to expand its market share. And there are some things that I don't think Gary Gygax was particularly racist for a dude in the Midwest in the middle of the 60s and 70s. But I do think that, like, for example, notions of race science are in a lot of the Appendix N literature, and that's where this concept of race comes from. I mean, because it's not really race. If you really think about it, it's really species, but that's not that. It's conflated from moment one, and it's conflated because it's conflated in a lot of Gygax's source material. So getting rid of that, I don't know, it doesn't seem like such a bad thing to me. And it's going to be less alienating to people who pick up on the fact that there's a lot of ethnic stereotypes and whatnot in these race concepts. I mean, it's interesting, to compare D&D to, say, White Wolf, because White Wolf was always aiming to expand its racial demographics, but the reason in like the 90s when it did so, it often did so off racial stereotypes. Go back and read those early White Wolf books.
I actually was reading one of the older White Wolf books, and I was like, God damn, the Middle Eastern stereotypes in those books are pretty broad. I mean, they changed it in the like second and third edition, but like they initially had the Assamites, who were like the Arabs, who all they did was assassinate people, and then they had the Setites that were the Egyptians, and all they did was like seduce people and things like that. So yeah, I think this gaming culture has definitely changed, and I remember talking to some of the people who work for Games Workshop in the 1980s, and one of the things Games Workshop gets criticized now is like, oh, you have black space marines, there's more women in the thing. And if you speak to the guys who wrote in the 80s, they were like, look, we didn't deliberately like not put people of color in the game, but we were in like England in the 1980s, and we were just not even thinking about it. Was a niche hobby for people in the 1980s, but once it becomes mainstream, these issues of representation have an important business aspect to them.
Yeah, that's I was going to say right there, is that what tends to happen, and we see it in comics, we see it in animation, we see it all over the place, is that most writers, most creators pull from their own experience. And so when the entire industry is white male, you're going to get a lot of stories that are written from the perspective and the interests of white male.
And unlike comics, there's like a New York Jewish secret origin story either. With RP, you're starting in Indiana, right?
Exactly. So I think it's not weak, it's not woke. The term doesn't mean what it used to mean, to address the way that language changes over the 45 years that D&D has existed, and some of these modules have been out there, and the legacy of those things that is still in the books and the things that are being created now. It's not wrong to address that language changes, that representation has changed, and to be able to identify that from a cultural sense, sure, but it's all back to the business sense. And like you just said, it's bad business. It's dumb business not to try to appeal to a wider audience. And if you're pushing back against that, it's because, I don't know, you've latched on to the wrong things about the product, in my opinion.
I totally agree. So I just want.
Are you making a super niche product? It's the other reason to do that. But
yeah,
and they do. And if you want to have your racist, sexist D&D, you can buy Lamentations of the Flame Princess, no problem. But
or just the D&D framework is still there. Just go write your own
do what you want.
Crappy words on your character sheet. I don't care.
You can actually still play Beck Me if you want to. Like, it's still playable. They're not. You can find them. They're not hard.
So so we've been going for just over an hour. I know, it's probably late where Dan is. It's early where Varn is, and I have a 2-year-old who just broke into the room and is pulling my cable. So I kind of want to end here on some final thoughts. What do you think the future of D&D is? Dan, since you are our guest.
I think it's more popular now than it ever has been. I think role playing, like I said earlier, role playing as an entertainment, as a source of entertainment, as a social, it's a social thing, is here to stay. I think 2020 really showed us that it can be a virtual experience that is just as social. It lacks the actual in-person, quotient there, but it does allow you to connect in that way with people from all over the world. The people that we're looking to play D&D with over at Toy Galaxy are from the East Coast, the West Coast. They're all over the United States. So that aspect of it is here to stay. Dungeons and Dragons as a brand, I don't think is going anywhere because it's the oldest, because it's been around for so long. I think the future of Dungeons and Dragons is just a constant adjustment to wherever the culture is going, and whatever, it's just like anything else. Major League Baseball, the NFL, hockey, whatever, every once in a while they look at the audience and say, the audience isn't connecting with this anymore. We need to change something, whether it's for the television experience, let's put a chip in the puck so that you can see it better, or if it's for the actual, the game is moving too slow, so we need to put a timer on the pitcher. These kinds of little adjustments and stuff are always going to be there. And I think that's what Dungeons and Dragons will continue to do, is to adjust to how to keep new gamers coming in as technology changes, as the interest of the younger audience changes. How do you shift to make it more appealing to that? I don't think it's going anywhere.
Vaughn, any last thoughts?
I don't think it's going anywhere either. I think 5th Ed might not be going anywhere. It might be by far the longest standing D&D edition. I do think eventually it'll have rules bloat. I do think eventually they'll have to nuke it from the sky to get people to buy more books, because that's one of the things they have to perpetually do. Right. But I do think that. I also think we haven't discussed this, but both the open gaming license and the fact that you cannot legally copyright mechanics, which is an interesting loophole. This is how all these hacks of like a basic and early advanced are legal, in addition to the open gaming license. That not just Wizards of the Coast, Hasbro are going to continue to benefit off this. I think, there will continue to be a ton of subsidiary stuff that continues to subsist off this, both for unofficial 5e products. As well, I mean, with like DM's Guild, the amount of unofficial 5e products you can buy is a little bit overwhelming. I also think, I think Hasbro has learned from some of the mistakes of D&D past, so you won't have another 3-ed, like, I don't know, we're going to push 100 books a year. You're not going to have another 4th ed. It takes 2 hours to play one round of combat. It is slow in 5th ed, but it is not as slow as it is in 4th ed. These are nerd specifics, but they actually do matter for the popularity of the game. And I will also say, as my final thing, D&D is the only thing that got me to ever look at TikTok. Nothing else has ever done that. It has been my gateway into the world of TikTok, because D&D TikTok is a weirdly popular thing, and kind of a fascinating subculture in and of itself. So if there's a TikTok of it, it's probably going to survive to the next generation. Ipso facto, I think D&D's got at least another decade. D&D might outlast most of us, actually. So I'm not particularly worried about it. I do think we are going to continue to see this thing you're implying, though, are these niche developers who take reactionary stances because of the changes in the game. Partly because of angry fandoms, and partly, and I kind of implied this, because it's actually a weirdo good. If you're a small company with a very niche product that you don't need to sell a lot of, having a weird, pissed off reactionary fan base is actually useful. So we're going to continue to see that too. It's not going to go away, unfortunately. It's kind of a weird counter business incentive. That does not mean I think some of the people who are spouting that culturally reactionary stuff aren't sincere either, but it does actually work if you don't need a big mass base. But Hasbro, of course, does. And so I think all those things are going to continue. I think role-playing games, and not just D&D, I mean, we've seen the resurgence of Call of Cthulhu. We've seen the resurgence of Cult. We've seen all these cool games coming out of Sweden. You've even seen White Wolf kind of sort of come back a little bit. Well, not as White Wolf, as like 5 other publishers, but like there are tons of games right now. And the only thing I think I may say, what we may see is D&D will always probably be the biggest, but D&D's popularity will eventually kind of diffuse out as people get tired of 5th ed. They will look at other games and they will get interested in those other games. And particularly because a lot of them work the same way on the same online platforms and in person as far as getting people social. So, and I don't think that means people are going to quit playing D&D, because the other thing I think that I've seen culturally change is weird allegiances to specific games and brands just doesn't seem to be a thing amongst younger people. Like they can play Pathfinder one week, D&D 5th ed another, Call of Cthulhu another, Borg the other, and they might even play Lamentations of the Flame Princess if they're feeling particularly vile that day. It really depends.
Well, I want to thank Derek Varn and Dan Larson for joining for this first episode of Gaming Materials. I hope you will come back one day, Dan, to talk to us about gaming again. It was
Absolutely.
a real pleasure having you here.
Fun.
And hey, we could even do a one-off Dungeons and Dragons or Call of Cthulhu game one day.
I'm not running it.
No. I'm what they call a forever DM. So like I'm the forever DM of everything, but I run many games, so maybe we'll play an exciting game at some point in the future. But again, I would like to thank you both. I would like to thank everybody in the chat who joined us this evening. Yes, Pascal should definitely. I want to see Pascal playing Dungeons and Dragons. I think that would be quite funny. But Pascal was on Black News channel tonight, so check out Pascal on the Black News channel. Thank you for joining us. We will be back next month. Hopefully, we will have Discourse Miniatures joining us to talk about the evil empire that is Games Workshop. And this will be once a month. And if you like the show, let Jason know and we'll keep doing it. And again, thank you very much. So as I sign us up, I will be playing. I'll be playing a little video to get you all in the D&D mood, to see how corporate D&D has been. So we will see you all tomorrow evening, where I believe we will be joined by Dr. Osgood to talk about the pathway to universal healthcare. So good luck with that, Americans, because I still have my British universal healthcare. So we got that in 1945.
For now.
For now. Thank you so much, guys, and see you all soon.
Have a great night.
Have a great night.
Time to go back home, kids.
Let's go!
Fools! You'll never escape!
Go! Presto, do something!
Where's Uni?